A blind man cannot conduct an orchestra. That was the music industry's absolute rule in 1955. You had to see, you had to signal, you had to control. Ray Charles couldn't do any of that, but he did one thing nobody had thought of. He rewrote the rules and proved that genius sees with the mind, not the eyes. New York City, January 1955. Ray Charles sat across from Ahmet Ertegun in the Atlantic Records office. Between them lay a contract, the biggest of Ray's career. Full creative control, unlimited studio time, but there was one condition. "We want you to form your own orchestra," Ahmet said. "A big band, 16 pieces minimum, horns, strings, rhythm section, the whole package." Ray's face didn't change, but inside his mind was racing. An orchestra, his own orchestra. See, most people don't understand what that meant in 1955. Coordinating 17 different people, reading complex arrangements, cueing entrances with hand signals, watching for mistakes in real time. All things that required one fundamental ability, sight. And Ray Charles had been completely blind since age 7. Ahmet watched Ray carefully. He knew what he was asking. The music industry had never seen a blind band leader. There were blind musicians, sure, blind pianists, blind singers, but a blind conductor? That was different. "I know it sounds challenging," Ahmet said carefully, "but we believe you can. I'll do it." Ray interrupted. Ahmet blinked. You'll do it." "Yeah, I'll do it." "Ray, you understand what this means? You'll need to. I know exactly what it means." Ray's voice was firm. "And I'm telling you, I'll do it." Ahmet leaned back. He'd expected hesitation, doubt, questions. Instead, Ray Charles sat there with the confidence of a man who'd already figured it out. The truth was, Ray hadn't figured it out at all. He had no idea how he was going to conduct an orchestra he couldn't see. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. His mother didn't raise him to say, "I can't." Let me take you back for a moment. When Ray was going blind as a child, his mother Aretha did something most parents wouldn't do. She refused to help him. When 7-year-old Ray stumbled over furniture, she didn't move it. She made him memorize where everything was. When he couldn't find his shoes, she didn't get them for him. She made him search until he developed a system. When he wanted to chop wood but couldn't see the axe, she didn't stop him. She taught him to feel the grain, hear the split, sense the swing. People in their Florida town thought she was cruel, but Aretha knew something they didn't. She knew that the world wouldn't make accommodations for her blind son, so she taught him not to need accommodations. She taught him to find different ways. And now, 20 years later, sitting in that Atlantic Records office, Ray Charles was about to apply that lesson to the biggest challenge of his career. The news spread fast. Ray Charles is forming an orchestra. Within the music industry, reactions ranged from skeptical to openly mocking. He's gonna conduct. How? This is Atlantic throwing money away. Give it 6 months, it'll collapse. The musicians' union was particularly concerned. They sent a representative to meet with Ray. "Mr. Charles, we need to discuss safety protocols. How will you ensure?" "I'll handle it," Ray said. "But you can't see if someone's in distress or if equipment is." I said, "I'll handle it." The union rep left shaking his head. Even some of Ray's friends tried to talk him out of it. "Ray, man, maybe start smaller? A quartet? A quintet?" "Nah, but how are you gonna?" "I'll figure it out." That phrase became Ray's mantra. "I'll figure it out," because the truth was, he didn't have a plan yet. But he had something more important, absolute refusal to accept limitation. February 1955. Ray began auditions for his orchestra. He rented a rehearsal space in Harlem. Word went out. Ray Charles was hiring. On the first day, 42 musicians showed up. Trumpet players, saxophonists, trombonists, bass players, drummers, all professional, all experienced, and all wondering the same thing. How is a blind man going to judge our playing? Ray sat at the piano. His road manager, Jeff Brown, stood beside him. "Okay," Jeff announced. "One at a time. Play whatever you want. 16 bars." The first trumpet player stepped up. Young kid, confident. He played a complex bebop line. Fast runs, high notes, technical fireworks. When he finished, he looked at Ray expectantly. Ray said nothing for a moment. Then, "You're rushing. Your time is unsteady in bars 9 through 12, and you're overblowing on the high notes, compensating for weak breath support." The room went silent. The trumpet player's jaw dropped. "How did you—" "Next," Ray said. One by one, musicians played, and one by one, Ray dissected their performances with surgical precision. Your intonation is flat in the middle register. You're scooping into notes, lazy embouchure, good tone, but you're not listening to the rhythm section. The musicians were stunned. Ray wasn't just hearing the notes, he was hearing everything. The subtle imperfections, the technical flaws, the musical choices. He was hearing things they didn't even know they were doing. By the end of the day, Ray had selected his orchestra, 16 of the best musicians in New York, but selecting them was the easy part. Now came the impossible part, actually leading them. March 1955, first rehearsal. The 16 musicians sat in a semicircle, music stands in front of them. Sheet music ready. Ray sat at the piano. For a long moment, nobody moved. The musicians looked at each other, then at Ray, then at each other again. How was this going to work? In a normal orchestra, the conductor stands in front, makes eye contact, gives cues with hand signals, mouths instructions, physically shapes the music with gestures. Ray couldn't do any of that. He couldn't see who was ready to play. He couldn't signal entrances. He couldn't watch for mistakes. He couldn't even confirm that everyone was in position. The lead saxophonist, David "Fathead" Newman, finally spoke up. "Ray, how do you want to do this?" Good question. Ray had been asking himself the same thing for weeks. He'd laid awake nights trying to figure out how to lead musicians he couldn't see, how to coordinate parts he couldn't read visually, how to conduct an orchestra when every conventional method required sight, and he still didn't have a complete answer. But he had the beginning of one. "All right," Ray said. "Here's how we're going to do this. When I call your name, you play. When I don't, you don't. Simple as that." The musicians exchanged glances. "That's it? That's the system? Let's try it," Ray continued. "We're going to start with 'I Got a Woman.' Fathead, you got the intro, 4 bars, then trumpets come in, then trombones, then full band." He started playing piano. "Fathead, go." David played the saxophone intro, 4 bars, then silence. The trumpets didn't come in. Ray stopped playing. "Trumpets, why didn't you come in?" You didn't cue us," one of them said. "I called for Fathead. After 4 bars, you come in. That's the arrangement." "Yeah, but you didn't signal." "I'm signaling with my voice. When I call your section, you play. But in the middle of a song, how do we—" "You listen. You count. You know the arrangement." Another awkward silence. This wasn't working. The musicians were used to watching a conductor, reading visual cues, following hand signals. Ray was asking them to work completely differently, to listen instead of watch, to think instead of follow, to know the music so well that they didn't need to be shown when to play. They tried again, and again, and again. Each time, it was a disaster. Missed entrances, wrong cues, chaos. After 2 hours, frustration filled the room. One of the trombone players stood up. "Ray, man, I don't think this is going to work. We need to see cues. That's just how orchestras function." Several musicians nodded in agreement. Ray sat at the piano, silent. He could feel it. The doubt, the skepticism, the belief that he was trying to do something truly impossible. Maybe they were right. Maybe a blind man really couldn't conduct an orchestra. Maybe some barriers just couldn't be broken. But that night, alone in his apartment, Ray Charles made a decision. If the traditional system didn't work for him, he wouldn't use the traditional system. He would invent a new one. And what he created that night would change not just his career, but the entire concept of how music could be led. Ray Charles didn't sleep that night. He sat at his apartment piano, thinking. Not playing, just thinking. The problem was clear. Traditional orchestral conducting relied entirely on visual communication, hand signals, eye contact, physical gestures, none of which Ray could use. But there had to be another way. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "You don't see with your eyes, Raymond. You see with your ears and your mind." Okay. So if he couldn't use his eyes, he'd use everything else. His ears, his memory, his voice, his sense of space. By sunrise, Ray had the foundation of a completely new system. A system nobody in music history had ever tried. The next morning, Ray called Jeff Brown. "I need you to do something for me." Ray said, "Get me a Braille typewriter, and I need every arrangement we're going to play transcribed into Braille." Jeff was confused. "Ray, you already know the songs. I know how to play them. But I need to know every single part, every instrument, every entrance, every dynamic, every rest, Everything. That's gonna take weeks. Then we start now. Over the next month, Ray did something unprecedented. He had every orchestral arrangement transcribed into Braille musical notation. Then he sat down and memorized them, not just his piano part. Every part. He memorized what the first trumpet played in measure 17. He memorized when the third trombone had a rest, in measure 42. He memorized the exact rhythm the drummer played during the bridge. He memorized all of it. When Jeff asked why, Ray's answer was simple. I can't watch them play, so I need to hear them in my mind before they play. If I know what's supposed to happen, I'll know when something's wrong. It was brilliant, but it was also exhausting. Most conductors learned the general shape of a piece, the melody, the key moments. Ray was learning every single note of every single instrument. He was building a complete mental model of the music, a three-dimensional sound map that existed entirely in his mind. April 1955, second rehearsal. The musicians returned, skeptical. The first rehearsal had been a disaster. Most of them expected Ray to give up, hire a sighted conductor, accept reality. Instead, Ray walked in with a new approach. All right, he announced, we're doing this differently. First thing, I need everyone to stay in the same position every time. Fathead, you're always at my 10 o'clock. Trumpets at 12. Trombones at 2. Rhythm section behind me. Don't move, ever. The musicians nodded. That made sense. Second thing, I've memorized every arrangement. All of them. Every part. So I know what you're supposed to play before you play it. A few eyebrows raised. Third thing, I'm gonna call cues by name, not by gesture. When I say your name, you come in. When I say trumpets, that's your section. When I say fathead, that's you specifically. David Newman leaned forward. In the middle of a song, yeah. While you're playing piano, yeah. And singing, yeah. The room was silent. Fourth thing, Ray continued, I need you to lock into the rhythm, not watch for it. Feel it. I'll stomp my foot for tempo. Listen for that. He demonstrated. His right foot hit the floor. Solid. Steady. Like a metronome. And fifth thing, trust your ears. If you can hear me and you know the arrangement, you know when to play. You don't need to see a signal. You need to listen. It was a complete paradigm shift. Instead of a visual orchestra, Ray was building an audio orchestra. Instead of watching, they'd listen. Instead of following gestures, they'd follow sound cues. Instead of reading a conductor's face, they'd read the music itself. Let's try it, Ray said. They started with I Got a Woman. Ray counted off with his foot. 1, 2, 3, 4. His hands hit the piano. The rhythm section locked in. Fathead. David's saxophone came in. Perfect timing. 4 bars later. Trumpets. The trumpet section entered. Together. On time. 4 more bars, bones. The trombones joined. Exactly when they should. Ray was playing piano, singing and calling cues simultaneously. His foot kept steady time. His voice directed the orchestra. His piano anchored the rhythm. And somehow, miraculously, it was working. The musicians looked at each other in amazement. When the song ended, there was stunned silence. Then David started laughing. Man, that was crazy. But it worked. Ray smiled. Again. And this time I won't call every cue. You should know when to come in. They played it again. This time, Ray only called the tricky entrances. The rest, the musicians anticipated. Because they were listening. Really listening. Not just to Ray. To each other. To the whole sound. They were functioning as a unit based on audio communication rather than visual cues. It was revolutionary. But Ray wasn't done innovating. Over the next few weeks, he developed additional techniques. Spatial memory. Ray memorized exactly where each musician sat. He could point directly at someone without seeing them. If he heard a mistake from his 2 o'clock position, he knew exactly who made it. "Second trumpet, you're sharp," he'd say, pointing accurately. The musicians were amazed. How did he know? Because Ray's brain had mapped the room. His hearing had become so precise that he could locate sound sources with pinpoint accuracy. Verbal dynamics. Instead of hand signals for volume, Ray used his voice. "Horns, bring it down," he'd say during a rehearsal. Or saxes. "More energy." Simple. Direct. No visual cue needed. Rhythmic anchoring. Ray's foot became the orchestra's metronome. Always steady. Always reliable. Musicians learned to feel that pulse. It connected them all to the same tempo, even when Ray's hands were busy on the piano. Pre-rehearsal sessions. Before full rehearsals, Ray met with each section separately. He'd sit with the trumpets and go through their parts, then the sax, then the trombones. He learned each musician's individual sound, their tendencies, their strengths, so during performance, he could identify who was playing just by timbre. "Marcus, you're dragging," he'd say to the third trumpet. Marcus would be stunned. "How'd you know it was me?" "I know your sound." That by June 1955, the Ray Charles Orchestra was tight. Really tight. They'd developed a musical telepathy, a connection that went beyond visual cues. They weren't watching a conductor. They were listening to each other, and that made them better musicians. Most orchestras became dependent on a conductor's signals. They followed rather than internalized. Ray's orchestra had to internalize everything. They had to know the music deeply, think independently, anticipate changes. It made them sharper, more musical, more alive. But the real test was coming. Studio recordings were one thing, rehearsals were another. The real question was, could this system work in front of a live audience? Could Ray Charles actually conduct an orchestra on stage, in real time with thousands of people watching? The music industry was about to find out. July 1955, Apollo Theater, Harlem, New York. The Ray Charles Orchestra's first public performance. Backstage, tension was thick. The musicians were nervous. This was it. The moment that would prove whether Ray's system actually worked under pressure. Jeff Brown pulled Ray aside. "You sure about this, man?" "Yeah. I mean, if something goes wrong, it won't. But if it does..." "Jeff." Ray's voice was firm. "I got this." Jeff nodded. He'd learned to trust Ray's confidence, but he was still terrified. The Apollo Theater held 2,000 people. Every seat was full. Word had spread. Ray Charles was attempting the impossible, leading an orchestra blind. Some people came to see genius. Others came to see failure. The curtain was still down. Ray and his 16 musicians stood on stage. Ray could hear the crowd murmuring, feel the anticipation, sense the skepticism. One of the trumpet players whispered, "Ray, you got this." Ray smiled. "Yeah, I got this." He walked to the piano, sat down, put his hands on the keys. His foot found its position on the floor. Behind him, 16 musicians held their instruments. "Ready." The stage manager's voice came through. 30 seconds. Ray took a deep breath. This was it. Everything he'd built, everything he'd innovated, everything he'd proven in rehearsal. Now he had to prove it to the world. The curtain began to rise. Light flooded the stage. 2,000 people stared, and Ray Charles, completely blind, prepared to do what everyone said was impossible. The first note he played would either validate his genius or confirm everyone's doubt. What happened in the next 45 minutes would shock the entire music industry and change the way people thought about leadership, disability, and human potential forever. The spotlight hit Ray Charles. 2,000 people held their breath. Ray's fingers touched the piano keys. His foot found the floor. 1 stomp, 2 stomps, 3 stomps, 4. Then he played. The opening notes of "I Got a Woman" filled the Apollo Theater. Ray's voice came out strong, powerful, full of soul. Behind him, the orchestra sat ready. Fathead, David Newman's saxophone, cried out. Exactly on cue. The audience stirred. Okay, that worked. But could he sustain it? Trumpets. The brass section blasted in. Perfect unison. Perfect timing. People in the front rows leaned forward. Wait, he's actually doing this. Bones. The trombones joined. The sound was massive. Professional. Tight. Ray was playing piano with both hands, singing with full voice, calling cues between phrases, keeping tempo with his foot, all simultaneously. The musicians behind him were locked in, not watching him, listening to him. They heard his foot, they heard his voice, they heard each other, and they played like they'd been together for years. Halfway through the song, Ray did something unexpected. He stopped calling cues. The orchestra kept playing. Every entrance, every change, every dynamic shift. They knew the music so well they didn't need direction anymore. Ray had trained them to function as a unit, to internalize rather than follow, and now they were proving it. When I Got a Woman ended, the Apollo Theater erupted. People jumped to their feet. They weren't just applauding a good performance. They were applauding the impossible being done. But Ray wasn't finished. For the next 45 minutes, Ray Charles led his orchestra through a complete set. Slow ballads, up-tempo blues, gospel-infused soul, jazz standards, every style, every mood, and in every song his system worked flawlessly. When he needed a trumpet solo, he called out, "Marcus, take it." Marcus stood and played 8 bars of improvised brilliance. When he needed dynamics, he used his voice. Saxes, pull back, rhythm, push forward. The sound shifted instantly. When he needed a key change, he announced it, modulating to E-flat. Here we go. The whole orchestra transitioned smoothly. He was conducting with sound instead of sight, leading with his ears instead of his eyes. And it was working better than anyone had imagined. Music industry executives who'd come to watch Ray fail were now taking notes. Musicians who'd doubted him were shaking their heads in disbelief. Critics who'd written him off were scrambling to rewrite their reviews. Backstage, Jeff Brown was crying. He'd seen Ray face 100 obstacles. But this was different. This was Ray Charles proving that disability didn't mean inability. That innovation could overcome any barrier, that the rules weren't rules, they were just habits, and habits could be changed. The final song was Georgia on My Mind. Slow, emotional, intimate. Ray's voice carried the weight of everything he'd overcome, every doubt, every obstacle, every person who'd said it couldn't be done. The orchestra supported him perfectly, strings swelling at exactly the right moment. Horns punctuating with precision, rhythm section holding steady, not because they were watching his hands, because they were feeling his heart. When the last note faded, the Apollo Theater was silent. Then, like thunder applause, people stood, they cheered, they shouted. The ovation lasted 5 full minutes. Ray sat at the piano, unable to see the standing crowd, but he could hear them, and he knew. He'd done it. The next morning, the reviews hit. The New York Times. Ray Charles has accomplished what many thought impossible. His orchestra performs with a precision and soul that rivals any in the nation. His blindness isn't a handicap. It's an innovation. Downbeat magazine. We witnessed history last night. Ray Charles didn't just conduct an orchestra. He reimagined what conducting could be. Amsterdam News. The genius proves again that genius sees with the mind, not the eyes. Within weeks, the Ray Charles Orchestra was booked solid. Apollo Theater, Cotton Club, Birdland. Every major venue in New York wanted them. Then the national tours started. Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, Atlanta. Everywhere they went, the reaction was the same. Shock, disbelief, then wild applause. But the impact went beyond just performances. Ray's system started changing the industry. Other blind musicians saw what he'd done and realized, I can do that too. Music schools started teaching his techniques. Verbal cueing, spatial awareness, audio-based coordination. The musicians' union, which had opposed him, now held him up as an example. And orchestras everywhere began to question their assumptions. Did conductors really need to use hand signals? Could musicians function better when they listened more and watched less? Was there innovation hiding in constraints? Ray had proven the answer was yes. 1961 Carnegie Hall, New York City. 6 years after that first Apollo Theater performance, the Ray Charles Orchestra now had 24 members. Full string section, extended brass, the works. This was the pinnacle. Carnegie Hall, where the greatest orchestras in the world performed. And Ray Charles, blind since age 7, was about to conduct the... Backstage, a reporter asked him, "Mr. Charles, do you ever wish you could see the orchestra you've built?" Ray thought for a moment. Then he smiled. "I see them every day, just not with my eyes." "What do you mean?" "I see them with my ears. I see the first trumpet's tone. I see the saxophone's emotion. I see the drummer's pocket. I see everything that matters." "But don't you feel limited?" Ray's smile faded. His voice became serious. "Let me tell you something. People think blindness is a limitation, but it forced me to develop skills sighted people never need. I hear things they can't hear. I remember things they'd write down. I connect with music on a level that doesn't require eyes." He paused. "My mother taught me that when I was 7 years old. She said, 'Raymond, you're not disabled. You're just different. And different can be better if you make it so.'" Did you make it better? Ray thought about the journey, the doubts, the innovation, the system he'd built. "I made it mine," he said, "and that's all that matters." That night, Carnegie Hall was packed. 3,000 people, orchestra critics, classical music purists, jazz legends, soul music fans. Everyone wanted to see the blind man conduct. The lights went down. The curtain rose. Ray Charles walked to the piano. Behind him, 24 musicians sat ready. He didn't need to see them. He knew exactly where each one sat, knew their sounds, knew their strengths. They were extensions of his musical mind. His foot hit the floor. 1, 2, 3, 4. And they began. For 90 minutes, the Ray Charles Orchestra performed flawlessly. Beethoven arrangement, Duke Ellington tributes, Ray's original compositions, classical, jazz, soul, gospel, every genre, every style, and through it all Ray led without seeing, conducting with his voice, his foot, his piano, his presence. The audience watched in awe. This wasn't just a concert. This was a demonstration of human potential, of what happens when someone refuses to accept limitation, when innovation meets determination, when genius operates on its own terms. When the final note sounded, Carnegie Hall exploded. Standing ovation, immediate, universal, 3,000 people on their feet, applauding not just the music, but what the music represented. Proof that the impossible is just the unexplored, that rules are made to be rewritten, that seeing isn't believing, doing is believing. Ray stood at the piano, listening to the ovation. He thought about his mother, about the doubters, about the music executives who'd laughed, and he smiled, because he hadn't just proven them wrong, he'd shown them a better way. From 1955 to 1998, they performed over 5,000 concerts. They won 12 Grammy Awards. They launched the careers of dozens of legendary musicians, and they proved night after night that a blind man could not only lead a band, he could lead it to greatness. But Ray's innovation did something bigger. It changed how people thought about disability. Before Ray, blindness was seen as a limitation you had to work around. After Ray, it was seen as a difference you could work with. His system became standard in music education. His techniques were studied in leadership courses. His story became proof that human beings can adapt to anything if they're creative enough, determined enough, courageous enough to rewrite the rules. In 2004, Ray Charles died. Thousands attended his funeral. Musicians from his orchestra, legends he'd inspired, people whose lives he'd changed.
One of his trumpet players, now 70 years old, gave a speech. "People ask me what it was like to play for a blind conductor," he said. "And I tell them, Ray wasn't blind. He saw more than any of us. He saw the music we were going to play before we played it. He saw the mistakes we'd make before we made them. He saw the potential in every one of us before we saw it in ourselves. Ray Charles didn't overcome blindness. He transformed it into a superpower." So here's what they don't tell you about Ray Charles. They said a blind man can't conduct an orchestra. They were right, if you use the old rules. But Ray Charles didn't use the old rules. He wrote new ones. He proved that genius doesn't need to see. It just needs to imagine, and then, relentlessly, make that imagination real. That's the real story. Not about a blind man who overcame his disability. About a genius who refused to let other people's limitations become his own. About an innovator who saw possibilities nobody else could see, even though he couldn't see at all.